everyone hear me okay? Is that good? Right. That's better for you. Okay. Sure. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Great. Okay, if everyone can hear me, I'll just begin then. I'm honoured indeed to speak again in Yamaguchi. When I was invited to Yamaguchi in 1995, I spoke about Patrick Geddes as a visual thinker, particularly with respect to the valley section and the notation of life. Great, excellent. Is that one going to be better? Yeah, that seems fine. Right. Okay, so I was speaking particularly with respect to the valley section and the notation of life when I was here before. Geddes's visual thinking will again, of course, be central. I'll just hold it. Geddes's visual thinking will again, of course, be central to my theme here, but my emphasis will be to consider his advocacy of visual art from the perspective of his concern for international cultural renewal. Slides, please. I begin with an example of Geddes's use of art in the cause of cultural revival in Edinburgh in the 1890s. This is The Awakening of Cuchulainn by John Duncan, which is the starting point of a mural scheme for Geddes's student hall of residence at Ramsay Lodge. It shows the awakening of a Celtic hero from a restorative sleep, his wounds healed after battle. The opportunity for fully appreciating its cultural revival significance is to be found in the mural border in the illuminated quotation. As it hath been, so shall it be. This is a contraction of a passage from the Bible. The thing that hath been is that which shall be. These words resonate not only with the cyclic aspects of Geddes's thinking, but also with another revival implying verse being used by Geddes at that time. This was a poem attributed to the 6th century Celtic saint, Columba, which concludes, "But ere the world come to an end, Iona shall be as it was." Next slides, please. The poem would seem to be directly relevant here. Here we see a picture of Iona with the abbey in its unrestored condition. It's now been restored. The poem would seem to be directly relevant to this, for it was quoted in 1895 by Geddes in an essay in his magazine The Evergreen. The essay had the strongly cultural revivalist title, The Scots Renaissance. That is to say, Scots Rebirth. St Columba was a figure of great interest to Geddes's circle, the more so because the 1300th anniversary of his death fell in 1897. The restoration of his cathedral on the sacred island of Iona began in 1899 and can be seen as part of the cultural renewal in Scotland during this period. Next slides, please. I do not have the space here to discuss the whole mural series in detail, but it progresses from the symbolic exhortation to cultural renewal and revivification represented by the awakening of Cuchulainn, via images of pre-Christian and Christian legend, through a transition from critical theology to academic discourse of an identifiably modern type, until it culminates in a mural of the admirable Crichton, which you see here on your right, an image of action and youthful scholarship. Crichton, born in 1560, was the archetype of the young Scottish and European Renaissance scholar, and is shown here, as the guidebook notes, as representing both thought and action. His inclusion strikes a personal note for Geddes, for he is reputed to have been educated at Geddes's old school, the Grammar School of Perth, and at St Andrews University, with which, as Professor of Botany at University College Dundee, Geddes was currently linked. This is thus very much a visual manifesto of cultural renewal, fit for the common room of an academic hall of residence. Next slides, please. It will be clear from these images of national revival that these images of national revival are strongly international in ethos. Such an international ethos was shared by all the artists of Geddes's circle. One can see this clearly in the Evergreen. Along with the influence of ancient Celtic art of Scotland and symbolist developments in France, another profound artistic influence was, of course, Japan. One image, Madame Chrysantheme by E.A. Hornell, which we see here on the left, is based on direct experience, for Hornell had visited Japan along with his friend George Henry in 1893-4. And on the right, we see a work by George Henry painted during that visit. Next slides, please. In 1890, these two artists had collaborated on a pioneering image of the Celtic revival in Scotland, Druids bringing in the mistletoe, and their work as a whole thus indicates the closeness of interest in matters Celtic and Japanese among many Scottish artists. In many of the evergreen images, a formal debt to Japan is very clear. Notable here is Robert Burns's Natura Naturans, which we see on the right, which draws on European symbolism, but at the same time makes direct reference, particularly in its approach to waveforms, to the Japanese printmakers such as Hokusai and Hiroshige. What I want to emphasize here is that this period of Geddes's activity towards 1900 reflects his increasing internationalism and his increasing awareness of cognate concerns about cultural revival in other countries. Of particular importance for Geddes were developments in India, and India at this time acted as a point of cultural reference, not just for Patrick Geddes, but also for Japanese thinkers and artists. Thus, although, so far as I know, the direct links between Japan and Geddes seem to have been made on the planning side rather than the arts side, there are interesting visual arts links, not only in terms of influence, as we see here, but also in terms of links mediated by India. And it is to Geddes's Indian contacts that I now turn. Next slides, please. Writing about Patrick Geddes's educational activities at the Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1900, his friend James Mather notes the presence in Geddes's circle of Swami Vivekananda, who we see on the left, and his disciple, the Irish woman Margaret Noble, better known as Sister Nivedita, who we see on the right here. 7 years earlier, at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, Vivekananda had shifted perception of Hinduism by presenting it to the world at large as a major religion, emphasizing its antiquity. Indeed, taking his lead from the ideas of Ramakrishna, Vivekananda articulated the case for Hindu revival. In Paris in 1900, he lectured on Indian art, rejecting theories of Hellenistic influence and underlining the independent value of the early Buddhist art of India. In due course, Sister Nivedita was to develop this position, as was, in a more systematic way, another of Geddes's friends, Ananda Coomaraswamy. Vivekananda died in 1902, but Nivedita continued to be one of Geddes's valued intellectual allies up until her death in 1911. In a memoir of Nivedita printed in the Sociological Review in 1913, Geddes recalled their first meeting in New York and how it continued into intimacy and collaboration during the following summer at the meeting of the International Association, which became the summer school of the Paris exhibition of that in many ways memorable year, as Geddes himself says. Nivedita had much in common with Geddes. Both complemented their dedication to cultural revival with a passionate interest in new educational methods. Indeed, prior to her involvement with Vivekananda, as Margaret Noble, she had been a respected advocate of the methods of the educational reformers Pestalozzi and Froebel. Next slides, please. The link between Geddes and Nivedita thus places in close touch with one another a central figure of the Celtic revival in Scotland, which I here represent on the left by a detail from the Book of Kells, made in Iona in about the year 800, and a central figure of the Hindu revival in India, which I here represent with a bronze Shiva Nataraja made in the 12th century in South India. Nivedita's closeness to Geddes's thinking is clear from her book, The Web of Indian Life, which was published in 1904. Here she says, "The foundation stone of our knowledge of a people must be the understanding of their region, for social structure depends primarily upon labour, and labour is necessarily determined by place. Thus we reach the secret of thought and ideals." Nivedita's commitment to the principles of place, work and folk, and Geddes's associated notion of regional survey, could hardly be more emphatic. She makes her personal debt to Geddes clear in an epigraph in which she thanks Geddes who, and I quote, "by teaching me to understand a little of Europe, indirectly gave me a method by which to read my Indian experiences." It's noteworthy that Geddes's whole contact with Nivedita took place before he went to India himself. This serves to emphasize that regardless of whether he had in fact visited a place, Geddes's commitment was to traditional revivals worldwide, and that he recognized from the outset that his own activities in Scotland were just one local and national expression of an international movement. Another of Geddes's key Indian contacts was the cultural revivalist poet and educator Rabindranath Tagore. Tagore wrote in the introduction to the 1918 edition of Sister Nivedita's book, The Web of Indian Life, and in that introduction, Tagore has, has a distinct relevance from the perspective of cultural renewal. It is an assertion of Nivedita's significance in the struggle against what Frantz Fanon, in a later colonial context, was to call inferiorism. Although, as Tagore notes, our critics not only have the power to give us a bad name, but also to hang us, the essence of inferiorism lies not in the direct power of the oppressor, it lies in the adoption and indeed advocacy of the values of the oppressor by the oppressed, and the simultaneous rejection by the oppressed of their own values and culture. Thinkers such as Tagore, Geddes and Nivedita resisted such oppressive cultural dynamics, and it is in this context that for Tagore, Nivedita uttered the vital truths about Indian life. In a Japanese context, a leader of this resistance was Nivedita's friend, the remarkable Okakura Kakuza, of whom Kiyoshi has already talked. Next slides, please. Published along with Geddes's memoir of Nivedita in 1913, Tagore's own memoir of this remarkable woman recalled her versatile all-round genius. He characterized her as a mother of the people, noting her uniqueness in this respect. This last phrase brings to mind one of the seminal images of the revival in Bengali painting, Bharat Mata, or Mother India, which we see here on the left, painted in 1905 by Rabindranath's nephew, Abanindranath Tagore. It is a crucial image in the regeneration of Indian art. In political significance, it relates to the nationalist unrest which followed the politically motivated partition of Bengal the same year. Iconographically, it is something of an analogue to John Duncan's Awakening of Cuchulainn, which we've already seen, or perhaps even more so to his Anima Celtica, which we see here on the right. Both works have been produced from a cultural nationalist standpoint. Both of the John Duncan works were produced from a cultural nationalist standpoint as part of Geddes' Edinburgh activities a decade earlier than the Tagore work was painted. Pata Mitta has pointed out that Bharat Mata was personified as a Bengali woman holding 4 symbolic objects in the conventional manner of a Hindu deity, but that the objects themselves were not conventional and were emblems of nationalist aspiration towards economic and cultural self-sufficiency, representing food, clothing, secular learning, and spiritual knowledge. John Duncan's Anima Celtica shares this female personification of nation, and where Tagore invokes the past through the traditional pose of his figure, Duncan invokes it through direct antiquarian reference, both through material culture and through legendary imagery. Where Tagore invokes the future through symbolic objects, for Duncan, and by extension for Geddes, the future, and indeed the past, is a book ready to be opened. This conjunction of Mother India and the soul of the Celt is thus illuminating. It is important not to force the comparison here, but it is equally important not to avoid it. My aim here is not to imply a crude causal connection, but to give context. The pages of the studio, for example, would have acted as a link between the circles of Abanindranath Tagore and John Duncan. In 1897, there had been extensive coverage of Duncan's Celtic Revival murals in Edinburgh. By 1903, E.B. Havell gave notice of the new movement in Indian art in the same journal. Havell had been appointed superintendent of the Government School of Art in Calcutta in 1896. In his 1903 paper, he takes pains to introduce Abanindranath Tagore's work. Next slide. In July 1905, the studio published a full-page colour reproduction of Tagore's The Banished Yaksha, which we see here on the left, as a frontispiece, and in 1908, Havell's definitional article on the Bengal School was published. That included a reproduction of Tagore's crucial image of Bharat Mata. Also illustrated was work by Nandalal Bose and Surendranath Ganguly. Havell uses the analogy of Roman domination of Celtic Britain to make his views of inferiorization of Indian culture clear. He comments further, in a manner worthy of Fanon, that the British had been civilizing India in the same way for more than 50 years and had succeeded in persuading educated Indians that they had no art of their own, though the evidences of its existence are many and great. And again, with respect to how this situation might be changed, he writes, after some years when the personnel of the committee had gradually changed and an infusion of Celtic blood had raised its artistic standard, I think he may be referring to Nivedita there, I ventured to propose that the old collection of European pictures should be sold. Next slides, please. This statement is illuminated by Havell's entire article, that's to say, is illuminated by the company it keeps in the studio. The issue begins with an account of the etchings of D.Y. Cameron by Frank Rutter. Cameron was soon to provide the frontispieces for the uniform edition of the works of Fiona MacLeod, many of which had first been published by Patrick Geddes and colleagues in Edinburgh in the mid-1890s. And here's one of Cameron's frontispieces of Iona on the left there. Towards the end of the same issue is a careful reproduction of a Japanese print, The Iris Garden by Kiyonaga, which we see on the right. This is introduced in the studio as the first of a series of reproductions of notable Japanese colour prints to be issued in the studio from time to time. Thus, Indian art in the shape of Havel's article is given context by both Scottish and Japanese. That same year of 1908 saw the publication of Havel's book Indian Sculpture and Painting. Havel thus provided institutional support underpinned by critical historical vision for the new painters. It's been noted that Nivedita's review of this book in 1909 was certainly as important for Indian readers as the book itself. And with respect to the development of the appreciation of this Indian visual art, Nivedita was much more than simply a reviewer of Havel's book. She had been given a primary source of inspiration. She had been a primary source of inspiration and guidance for Abanindranath Tagore through his mature development as an artist. In her activities as an art critic, she helped to clear and maintain the path that the Bengal school of painters were to follow. Crucial here, and of particular interest in the context of this paper, was Nivedita's link with the Japanese art critic and teacher, Okakura Kakuzo, who would in due course write one of the most influential of all discourses on East and West, the Book of Tea. Next slides, please. Thus, just as Geddes' work in Scotland must be seen in a pan-Celtic context, so the activities of Nivedita must be seen in a pan-Asian context, strongly influenced by Okakura. If Pan-Asianism has a defining moment, it is the visit of Okakura to Bengal in 1902. He had come with the intention of visiting Vivekananda, but this was prevented by Vivekananda's untimely death. Okakura was introduced to the Tagore family by Nivedita, and he completed his seminal book, Ideals of the East, with special reference to the art of Japan, while staying as a guest of Surendranath Tagore. Surendranath Tagore was the brother of the painter Abanindranath and nephew of the poet Rabindranath. Okakura's book begins with this famous quotation, which we can regard as a pan-Asian manifesto. Asia is one. The Himalayas divide only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, the Chinese with its communism of Confucius, and the Indian with its individualisms of the Vedas. But not even the snowy barriers can interrupt for one moment that broad expanse of love for the ultimate and the universal, which is the common thought inheritance of every Asian race, enabling them to produce all the great religions of the world and distinguishing them from those maritime people of the Mediterranean and the Baltic who love to dwell on the particular and to search out the means, not the end, of life. Tapati Guatakurta points out that Nivedita acted as the main mediator and promoter of Okakura's pan-Asian aesthetic, trying to harness it to the cause of nationalism and an artistic revival in India. Indicative of this was her introduction to Okakura's book, where she emphasizes the absurdity of the Hellenic theory of Indian artistic development, noting that Okakura argues that the actual affinities are largely Chinese. Reiterating Vivekananda and clearing the way for Coomaraswamy, she notes that Okakura argues that Greece falls into her proper place as but a province of that ancient Asia. Next slide, please. Furthermore, this pan-Asian culture was held to have ancient Indian Buddhist and pre-Buddhist thought as its point of origin. Thus, Indian culture, undermined by the ornamentalism, to use David Canadyne's useful term, of British rule, rediscovered itself at the centre of a pan-Asian stage. By this time, Okakura had taken on the major role of attempting to balance the westernization of Japanese culture of the Meiji period with traditional cultural values. Okakura wrote in the studio as early as 1902 of the Meiji Restoration as a renaissance which had the double task of returning to the classic ideals and at the same time of assimilating the new revolutionizing ideas. The problem for Okakura was to complement the overpowering power of Western science and culture, the overwhelming power of Western science and culture, with a return to tradition. To serve this end, he founded the Nippon Bijutsu Inn, an independent art school which, through its students, directly influenced developments in Calcutta. It was from this art school that Abanindranath Tagore and his Bengal Revival School took their cue, in particular from the work of Yokoyama Taikan and Ishida Shunso, both of whom had been sent to Calcutta by Okakura in 1903. According to Pata Mitta, Taikan's approach to his art left a deep impression on Abanindranath, and this work on the left here is by Tagore. Furthermore, Taikan was very much willing to explore Indian themes in his work, for example, the Ras Lila or love play of Radha and Krishna, and on the right here we see a work by Taikan of that precise scene. At the time of her death, Nivedita was writing a book which was eventually published in 1913 as Myths of the Hindus and Buddhists. Next slide, please. The task of finishing the book was undertaken by Ananda Coomaraswamy, and the book was published under both names. That publication marks a wider appreciation of the Bengal school, for as it stresses on the title page, it contains 32 colour illustrations by Indian artists under the supervision of Abanindranath Tagore. This was a significant exposure of the Bengal school painters, for the series in which the book was published was aimed at a mass market. The series was published in London by Harrop, and it had competition in due course from a series published by Gresham, a London imprint of the Glasgow firm of Blackie, which was also to make use of Bengal school illustrations. Gresham Gresham used not only Bengal school artists in Indian myth and legend, but also, in another title, the artist used was Geddes' colleague John Duncan. The author of these books was the prolific Donald A. Mackenzie, who was later to make very clear his interest in the relationship between Celtic societies and Buddhism in his speculative Buddhism in pre-Christian Britain. Mackenzie connects to a later generation of cultural revivalist activity in Scotland. He was both a respected writer on folklore and a poet, and he makes an appearance in the latter role in Hugh MacDermid's seminal anthology, Northern Numbers, published in 1920. That work became a foundation of the post-Geddes cultural revival in Scotland in the 20th century. Next slide, please. Although Geddes' activities in India after 1914 cannot be explored in detail in the present paper, it is nevertheless worth noting here that in this Indian context that one finds a contact between Patrick Geddes and his friend Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which resulted in a fascinating almost of world architecture, namely a building by Mackintosh in India. In addition, there is a Buddhist-derived formal element involved in Mackintosh's design, which adds relevance here. The project got no further than Geddes' commissioning of drawings from Mackintosh, but some of these have now been identified. From a joint Pan-Asian and Pan-Celtic perspective, what is interesting here is the influence of Indian Buddhist architecture on Mackintosh, specifically, as Alan Crawford has noticed, a direct reference to the gates of the Great Stupa at Sanchi, which occurs in Mackintosh's drawing of an arcaded street front. Crawford points out that one of these gates had been illustrated by W.R. Letherby in Architecture, Mysticism and Myth, but although Mackintosh's interest in Letherby's book is well established, it's highly likely that his actual source, or one of his other sources, was the Scot James Ferguson, who had written a history of English architecture, a history of Indian architecture. Next slides, please. These unrealised projects by Mackintosh in India can thus be seen as a contribution by the Scottish architect to the Indian cultural revival, made in the context of what has been called Geddes' careful attention to Indian and Hindu tradition. This careful attention is reflected in his lecture, The Divine Ideal in Indian Art, which, so far as I know, only exists in an undated typescript. It extends one's appreciation of Geddes' awareness of Pan-Asian issues, for there he makes reference to the travels in Tibet of the Japanese Buddhist monk Ekai Kawaguchi, who we see here on the right. Kawaguchi's book, 3 Years in Tibet, was published by the Theological Publishing House in Adyar in India in 1909 or 1910. By way of conclusion, I want to draw attention to another Edinburgh link to both Indian and Japanese art. This is the output of the Edinburgh publisher T.N. Fowles from about 1912 to 1919. Fowles published not only work by Patrick Geddes and his Scottish associates, including John Duncan, but also books by Ananda Coomaraswamy and by Okakura Kakuzo. Next slide, please. For example, John Duncan contributed notable Celtic Revival drawings, which we see here, to a T.N. Fowles publication in 1912. This was The Blue Blanket, a 4-part magazine described in very Geddesian terms as a civic review. It was inspired and probably edited by Geddes and written primarily by Geddes and his supporters. Contributors included Marjorie Kennedy Fraser, Ramsay Traquair, Frank Mears, A.P. Laurie, Otto Schlapp, Bruce J. Hume, J. Arthur Thompson, and Marion Newbigin, and of course Patrick Geddes himself. One of John Duncan's drawings, Cuchulainn, which we see here on the left, was later used as the frontispiece of Marjorie Kennedy Fraser's second volume of Songs of the Hebrides. Another, Riders of the Sidhe, was a preparatory design for one of Duncan's most well-known works. Next slide, please. A further Celtic Revival aspect of the Fowles list emerges with the publication of the Iona Books series from 1912 onwards. These books had a simple handmade wrapper printed with an interlaced cross design. For example, Fiona MacLeod's essay on Iona, The Isle of Dreams, was reprinted as one of the Iona books in 1913. Another title published that year by T.N. Fowles was Irishmen All, with illustrations by Jack B. Yeats. And we see an example of that on the right. The key Irish artist of his Yeats was the key Irish artist of his generation and also brother of W.B. Yeats. W.B. Yeats was, of course, leader of the Irish Celtic literary revival. And one should note here that Yeats himself had almost published a book with Geddes and colleagues back in the 1890s, and he was also a key supporter of Rabindranath Tagore in the West during just this period. Next slide, please. This then was the context for the publication by T.N. Fowles of Ananda Coomaraswamy's Arts and Crafts of India and Ceylon in 1913. This isn't the Fowles edition, but it's a direct reprint of it, an Indian reprint of the Fowles edition. This important popular introduction to the subject has a frontispiece of Krishna from Coomaraswamy's own collection, which, I suggest, influenced John Duncan's work. Thanks to the work of Elphick and Harris, much of T.N. Fowles' achievement can now be followed, but many questions remain unanswered. One may speculate, for example, that it was through Coomaraswamy's settling in Boston in 1917 to develop the Indian collection of the Museum of Fine Arts that in 1919 T.N. Fowles became the publisher of the first solely European edition of Okakura's classic English language statement of Japanese cultural principles, the Book of Tea. And here we see the Falls edition of that book. In terms of the cultural interaction of East and West, it is worth noting that Okakura had himself been given impetus for his work by Ernest Fenollosa, whom he had met in Tokyo, and whom he eventually joined in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts. It was in Boston in 1906 that Okakura's The Book of Tea was first published. The book was described in 1989 by Shojitsu Sen as a pioneering effort in the cultural bridge building between East and West, which continues to surprise with the freshness of its insights. Next slide, please. Coomaraswamy certainly valued Okakura's thinking, and he quotes several passages from Ideals of the East in his Buddha and the Gospel of Buddhism, which we see here, published in 1916. This, as you can see, contained Bengal school illustrations, along with several from China and Japan. Okakura's Book of Tea is also interesting from the perspective of its illustrations in the T.N. Falls edition. Artists whose work is reproduced include Corinne and Swami, and several images of tea bowls are reproduced, including, as we see here, examples from Karatsu and Hagi. Thus, the publication of Okakura's Book of Tea in Edinburgh by a publisher who also published Patrick Geddes is symbolic for me of the global renewal of culture which Geddes advocated. It is on that note of international cultural revival and the networks associated with it, whether in Scotland, India, or Japan, that I conclude. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Would you see any possible further researches into the Boston connection through to John McLaughlin?
Yes, and I'm sure you will devote a lot of time to them. Yeah, I think that's very interesting, Ellen. I think there are probably links in both directions. I think there was such a strong interest in Indian and general Oriental material in the earlier New England transcendentalist phase with people like Emerson and Thoreau, etc. So I think that would be important in one direction, and I would be extremely interested if one could extend it in the other direction, but I'd be very surprised if you couldn't, for the simple reason that Coomaraswamy continued in that post until his death in 1947, so I would suspect that would be very much on the cards. Yeah.
Well, you know that Lachlan was married to Emerson's niece.
Well, there you go.
So it's impossible for us to interpret.
Oh, sure, by all means, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to come and use the microphone as well, or? Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So from my position, so it's so unheardable, inaudible. So yes, I can trust it. Mr. Sato couldn't.
So, what do you want to do, Leo? Do you?
I mean, so I think the audience should understand your so the question about that and your answer to it, but I mean, so nobody understood it, so I couldn't.
well, I think it was just academically opaque. So, do you want us to repeat it then?
Yeah, so I think he should speak louder.
Yeah.
I asked Professor McDonald. I asked Professor McDonald if there would be any worth in pursuing the Boston connection through the publication of these books, because John McLaughlin, who was an artist, and also General MacArthur's cultural intelligence advisor on Japan during the war, who McLaughlin was a great authority on Sesshu, and the connections through to Boston, particularly through to the Museum of Fine Art, because McLaughlin started off his life, before he became an artist, collecting Japanese antiquities. And he spent the 10 years before the war started here in Japan, and had many associations with antiquarian dealers and writers in Tokyo. But it's a particular writing about the marvelous void of Sesshu, which I was alluding to in terms of the connection.
パブリケーションとの関係、出版物との関係で出てきた質問なんだと思うんですけれど、ボストンとの関係はそこに、ジョン・マクロフリンというスコットランド系の方だと思うんですが、やはりその、よく分かってないんですが、日本に戦前に10年ぐらい滞在して日本の仏教美術とかそういうものを収集した人がいて、そのコネクションというかその関係というものはありますかというような質問だったと思います。で、先ほどの、マクドナルド先生の答えは何でしたっけ
？And my reply was that I think there are very interesting connections there that can be explored, particularly with reference to the earlier New England transcendentalists such as Emerson and Thoreau, who were particularly interested in connections with the Eastern world and the relationship between West and East. So in a sense there's a line backwards to that, but there would also almost certainly be direct connections forward, not least because Coomaraswamy remained in post in Boston, and certainly in Boston. I don't know exactly when he gave up his role at the museum, but he remained in Boston up to his death in 1947, so far as I know. So he was very much in place there. So I think there would be links forward to McLaughlin. I'd be very surprised if there weren't.
ボストンとの関係は19世紀のエマソンとかソーロですか、そのトランセンダンタリスト超越主義ですかね、超越主義の詩人たちとのつながりであるのではないか。だから、超越主義の人たちはその東洋の思想に非常に興味を持っていたんだということですね。そしてそのクワラ・スワミーさんという方も、1947年99年に亡くなるまで、ボストンに最後の方住んでいましたということで、そこにそういうつながりはあると思います。それでジョン・マクロフリンの名前が出てきたので、ちょっと私も驚いたというか、ちょっと気づかなかったみたいなことをおっしゃったのかなと思います。 I have a question. Do you see difference between this cultural revival and nationalism?
Well, you better translate it. Do you want to translate your question?
We could just insist, I will do it. Or did you understand my question?
Yeah. It's very interesting, it's very subtle. But I think there are different there's no such thing as nationalism in a single sense, but there are a lot of different nationalisms. And I think cultural revival normally has some kind of nationalist component, but according to the political situation of the place where the cultural revival is happening, it has different political consequences. For example, in Ireland, which had a much more difficult relationship with England than Scotland, Ireland at this time, or soon after, actually became an independent state, but Scotland, which had tended to relate to England via treaty rather than invasion, is still connected to England. And so the political conditions make a difference to the way that a cultural nationalism is expressed politically. But nevertheless, I think there's always a nationalistic element. Having said that, I think Geddes' interest is very much what one would expect of him, which is that what he's concerned about in terms of cultural revival is actually as much to do with the local and the individual as to do with the national. It's just that the national is one of the levels between essentially the individual, the local, the national, the international. I mean, all these nested levels that go together with Geddes. So I think there definitely is a connection, but what interests Geddes is really what drives cultural revival from the local level. But what drives it from the local level definitely is a national expression.
その文化の復興というか伝統の復興ということがナショナリズム、民族主義ということと違いがあるんですかということをお聞きしました。
私が聞き取るためなんですけれども、ナショナリズムというのは、いろいろな、レベルといいますか、違いがあるということなんですけれども、その中で、今回はその、文化的な意味での、ナショナリズムという話だったと思うんですが、その中で、例えばそのポリティカルというか、その政治的な意味でのナショナリズムというのはまた違う意味があるだろうということをおっしゃっております。でその中で特に例えばイギリスと一つの国みたいにこう見えますけれども、実際はイングランドとアイルランドとスコットランドとウェールズというのがありまして、でその、イングランドとアイルランドの関係というのは、例えばイングランドとスコットランドの関係よりも、もうちょっとこう違うといいますか、どちらかというと、スコットランドとはよりもアイルランドとイングランドの関係の方がなんて言いますか、こう、侵略されるというか、侵略されるというような、関係にあるんじゃないかということです。それでゲデスにとってのそのナショナリズムという意味はそういうポリティカルな意味というよりも、もっとその個人的な意味ですとか、もっとそのローカルというか小さなスケールでの、意味での、ナショナリズムというところから、ですから政治的な枠組みの中でのナショナリズムというよりも、個人といいますか、人とかその人と場所みたいなところからこう積み上げてくるようなナショナリズムという、そういう捉え方をされているということですだと思います。
他にご質問がいいですか。
Mike, did you want?
Yeah. Thanks. It's maybe not so much a question as a further on that subject, which is interesting, I think. The idea of nationalism, maybe better expressed as self-determination, and the quote you have from Tagore about inferiorism, and just to say that there is an element of Geddes' work which is political in that sense, and thinking of the Indian connection and the fact that there was British troops in George Square, as well as at the same time as there are British troops in India, is interesting. Think of it in that context. I just wondered if you wanted to pick up on that at all.
I agree. No, that's no problem. I agree with the points, yeah. So that's fine. So it needs the translation now.
Sorry, so今マイクス・モーグさんがおっしゃったのは、そのさっきのお話の中に劣等主義ということが出てきました。インペリアリズムということがその植民地の支配されている支配を受けている人たちが支配している民族に対してその文化に関して非常に複雑な関係を持ってしまうわけですけれども、そういうことに関するゲディスの発言がある点上にそのゲディスの政治性を示しているのではないか。で先ほど私の質問に対するお答えの中でもそのアイルランドとそのスコットランドとのイングランドの関係ですね。それを比較したときにアイルランドっていうのはイングランドで侵略されたところですから、そこでその文化復興というものが持つ意味が非常に政治的な特にそこからイングランドが独立しようということにつながっていく。だからもちろんスコットランドの場合にもそういう政治的な面はあるけど、その違いがあるということですね。つまりその政治状況において政治状況の違いを反映してそういう違いが出てくるという面があるので、スコットランドの場合はイングランドとは条約というか取り決めで連合を組んでということですから侵略されたという関係ではない。それからその文化復興ということの意味合いもアイルランドとは違った形で出てくるということです。今そのこととちょっと関係あると思うんですけれども、インドにそのイギリスの軍隊がいる間にそのエジンバラの方にもイギリスの軍隊はいたという、つまりそのイングランドの支配ということがどっちにもあって、そういう状況の中で、ゲディスがそういう劣等主義ということに関してのいろんな発言をしている意味合いは非常に政治的なものでしょうということをスモーさんがおっしゃって、それに先生がそうですねというふうに同意いたしますということを言いました。その他に質問が。
Thank you very much for your marvelous lecture. And I think the point is very essential because, as you know, Dr. Helen Miller described Geddes as Geddes' stance as apolitical, not political. So, how do you think about Miller's view of Geddes apolitical? 僕が今言ったのは、今お話になったことはすごく本質的なことじゃないかなと思ってまして、デデスさんの、について書かれた代表的な本としてヘレン・メラさんの1999年の本なんですけど、その時彼女はデデスのアプローチというのは常にアポリティカル、その非政治的なアプローチっていうのを彼女はずっと取ってたんだっていうようなことを言ってたものですから、そのことについて先生はどう考えられるかということをお願いしました。
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think it's partly word use in that I think what she means by that, and I must admit I do not think it's a very good choice of word, but I think what she means that he is not interested in joining political parties. But I certainly don't think Geddes is apolitical. I don't think someone who has close friendships with some of the leading anarchists of the day, like Kropotkin and Reclus, and actually enables Reclus' nephew, Paul, to go into hiding under a pseudonym at the Outlook Tower and to work at the Outlook Tower. I don't think under any circumstances could we call him apolitical. I think he's simply interested in changing the polis, so to speak, changing the state in a way that doesn't depend obviously on the political structures of the day, which I think is one reason why he was attracted to anarchism. Although I'd emphasize that it was anarchism in an extraordinarily constructive point of view. Actually, I suspect that one of the reasons he was interested in anarchism is related to his Presbyterian background, simply because the structures of Presbyterian church hierarchy are almost without hierarchy. They simply depend on election and frequent change of leadership, which is about as anarchistic as you could get. So, apolitical, definitely not. Not interested in joining political parties, definitely.
分かる範囲で、そのリス自体はその政治的な活動ということには、基本的には参加してなかったというか、ということだと思いますが、ただアナーキスト、日本語に訳すと無政府主義ということになるかと思いますが、そういう人たちと関係があったということなんですが、それも無政府主義というとある意味破壊的な意味、今ある秩序を乱すっていう意味なんですが、そうではなくて、コンストラクティブな意味でのアナキズムっていうことを、という意味でゲデスは非常に興味を持っていたということで、その後その中の例として教会の、リーダーがどんどん変わるというか、非常に、しょっちゅう変わるというような、要するにそういう仕組み自体も何かサポートされてたような。あとお願いします。
ちょっと補いますと、私の分かったところで補いますと、アナーキストの、クロポトキンとか、ラクルーとの付き合いがあって、そのラクルーの追いかないと助けて、偽名を使って隠れるのを助けたというような、そこまで関与しているので、その非政治的ということはとても言えないということがまずあったと思います。それで、なんでそのアナキズムに関心があったかというと、そのアナキズムは国家の構造を変えようとしていて、そういう点でそれをポジティブに捉えて、建設的な意味に捉えて、非常に興味を持っていたということですね。でそれから、一つはそういうなぜアナキズムに興味があったかというと、
これはそのスコットランドの長老派の伝統と非常に関係が深いのではないかと。で長老派教会においては、これはイングランドの方の、その英国国教会の、いわゆるその監督制というビショップがいて、その下に、司祭がいて、その下に女祭がいてというような、そういう除会制度、カトリックと同じようなピラミッド構造のですね、除会制度の上に成り立ったそういう教会ではなくて、非常に民主主義的に、ほとんどそういう除会制度がないということですね。リーダーというのは選挙で選ばれて、そしてどんどん変わるという、そういう非常にアナキスティックな、ちょっと無政府主義的な要素が長老派の伝統の中にはあるということで、そこでそういうちょっと関係がやはりあるのではないかと、つまりスコットランド的な生活から来ているのではないかということをおっしゃってたと思います。それから、ゲディスは、だから非政治的でないということは絶対ないけれども、なんか政党に加わる、政治的な運動に加わるとか、そういうことには全く関心がなかった。
それではここで10分間の休憩に入ります。